The wind was blowing hard that afternoon in Hamburg, Germany. Inside a small apartment in the suburbs, Hans was spreading out maps and documents on a worn table. His eyes sparkled with a mixture of ambition and impatience as he explained the details of the plan to Klaus, who was sitting restlessly on the sofa. "Listen, Klaus, this is our golden chance." Hans banged the table hard, the sound echoing in the almost empty apartment. "Old Greta has lived alone in that place for years. No cameras, no security guards, and she's got a fortune she can't dream of using." Klaus, 25, with disheveled hair and a hesitant look, didn't seem as sure as his colleague. He scratched his thin beard, looking away from the window. "And how do you know she has that much money? She doesn't look like someone who shows off jewelry." Hans snorted, coming closer and leaning over Klaus. "I heard it from a reliable source. Her husband, before he died, left her a fortune in gold bars and jewelry. And she's so eccentric that she prefers to live in isolation, surrounded by forests. But nobody's that naive, Klaus. She must keep everything there." Klaus crossed his arms, visibly uncomfortable. "I don't know, Hans. It sounds complicated. What if we're wrong? What if she's just an old woman with an exaggerated family history?" Hans laughed scornfully, patting Klaus on the shoulder. "That's why you never climb the ladder, my friend. Always full of doubts. Trust me, it'll be quick and clean. We'll get in, get what we need, and get out before she has time to notice." Klaus hesitated, but necessity spoke louder. With few job options and bills piling up, he knew he couldn't refuse. "Right, Hans. I'm in, but only if everything is as you say. No problems." Hans flashed a victorious smile, as if he had already won the battle before it had even begun. He took out a map and began to trace the details of Greta's site. "Good. So, look here. Let's wait until Saturday night. That's when she's usually alone, reading or whatever. We'll climb over the wall here." Hans pointed to an area on the map. "And we go to the back door. I have a tool that opens any lock. Simple as that." Klaus still looked reluctant, but said nothing. As Hans continued to talk enthusiastically, his mind wandered. A voice in his head warned him that there was something strange about the story, but he ignored it. The plan was set, and the night of the raid was fast approaching. In the heart of the Black Forest, Greta's place looked like something out of a fairy tale, but with an air of mystery that would make any visitor hesitate. The house, a sturdy construction of stone and wood, was partially covered in vines. There was no sign of modern technology. No camera, no electric fence, just a meticulously tended garden and a stone path that led to the main entrance. Inside the house, Greta moved with the serenity of someone who knew exactly where everything was. At 69, her appearance reflected a life full of stories. Silver hair tied up in a bun, weather-beaten skin, but lively, observant eyes. After the death of her husband, a financial magnate, she had swapped the luxury of a city mansion for the solitude of the forest. Greta was adjusting a vase of flowers on the center table when Lupo entered through the kitchen door. With heavy steps, he circled the room, his bright eyes analyzing every corner before approaching her. "Lupo, my darling, another peaceful day, isn't it?" She stroked the large animal's head. Although Greta called him a dog, there was something unusual about his presence. Its black fur shone in an almost supernatural way, and its amber eyes seemed to see beyond what an ordinary animal would see. The few employees Greta had hired to look after the estate's maintenance had been whispering about Lupo for some time. Some swore that he was more wolf than dog, a wild animal tamed only by Greta's strength. Others said there was something magical about him, but no one dared ask. That afternoon, Greta sat on the balcony with a book, while Lupo rested beside her. Her son, Heinrich, had recently called, insisting once again that she install a security system. "Mutter, this is crazy. You're alone in this place in the middle of nowhere. At least a camera or two guards," he had said, with his characteristic tone of concern. Greta just smiled, refusing again. "My son, I don't need those things. I have everything I need here. And anyway, Lupo protects me. No one would dare cross the gates of this place." The call ended with Heinrich promising to insist on the subject during his next visit. Greta, however, knew that her choice to live in isolation was misunderstood by others. She liked the silence of the forest, the freedom to tend her garden, and the faithful company of Lupo. As night fell, Greta turned on the lights inside the house. The soft lighting gave the room a cozy feel. Lupo, for his part, got up and began his nightly patrol, circling the perimeter of the estate. He sniffed the air, on the lookout for anything out of the ordinary, while Greta remained calm, immersed in her world of words and memories. Outside, the shadows of the forest seemed to move with the wind, whispering secrets that no one would dare hear. It was a cold Saturday night. The tall trees around Greta's farm swayed in the icy wind, producing an unsettling sound. The silence of the forest was broken only by the occasional snapping of branches and a distant, almost imperceptible growl. Hans and Klaus were hiding behind a bush, assessing their surroundings. They were wearing dark clothes and simple masks, and carrying a bag with burglary tools. Hans held the portable ladder, while Klaus clenched his fists, trying to hide his nervousness. "You're shaking, Klaus. Relax. This is going to be easy," Hans whispered, adjusting his mask. "I think it's the cold," Klaus replied, but he knew it wasn't true. A bad feeling was growing inside him, but he was already too committed to give up now. Hans gave the signal, and they both moved forward. The ladder was positioned against the wall, and Hans was the first to climb. When he reached the top, he checked out the terrain ahead. The garden looked empty, peaceful, but something caught his eye. Large footprints, almost twice the size of a dog's, were marked in the wet earth. He hesitated for a moment but shook his head. It must just be a big dog. He muttered to himself before gesturing for Klaus to follow. The two of them jumped into the grounds. As they advanced, Klaus couldn't ignore the feeling that he was being watched. "Hans, did you see those footprints?" he asked in a low but alarmed tone. "Stop thinking nonsense. We're wasting time. The house is just around the corner." The plan went ahead as expected. They approached the back door, where Hans used a tool to deftly unlock the lock. The door creaked softly as it opened, revealing the cozy, well-lit interior of the house. The living room had antique furniture, scattered books, and an unlit fireplace. In the center of the room, in a rocking chair, was Greta, with a book in her hands. The front door was open, allowing the night breeze to come in and ruffle the curtains slightly. She looked up calmly, without seeming surprised. "Ah, visitors at this time of night," she said, quietly closing the book and placing it on the side table. Hans pulled Klaus inside, closing the door behind them. Greta looked them up and down, as if she already knew exactly who they were. "Old woman, you know why we're here," Hans said, pointing at her with a menacing tone. Greta tilted her head slightly, showing no fear. "I don't suppose it's for tea?" she replied with a slight smile. Klaus took a step back, disconcerted by the old woman's serenity. "Hans, there's something wrong. She doesn't seem worried." Hans ignored the comment and took another step forward, pointing the burglary tool as if it were a gun. "Cut that one out, ma'am. Show me where the jewelry and money are and no one gets hurt." Greta kept her gaze fixed on them, now with an intriguing glint in her eyes. She stood up slowly, picked up a lit candle from the table and started walking towards the corridor. "Follow me then. I'll show you what you're looking for." Hans gave Klaus a look of triumph, as if proving that everything was under control. Klaus, however, felt a shiver run down his spine. As they followed Greta through the house, the sound of a deep growl echoed through the living room, coming from somewhere outside the house. Klaus stopped immediately, grabbing Hans's arm. "Did you hear that?" "Hans, There's something out there. Hans shook his arm, freeing himself from Klaus's hand. Stop being a coward. It's just the wind. Let's get what we came for. Outside, among the trees, amber eyes watched every move, waiting patiently. Footsteps echoed across the wooden floor as Greta led Hans and Klaus through the house. The lantern Hans carried illuminated the walls decorated with old paintings and shelves full of books. The old woman walked with a disconcerting calm, almost as if she were in control of the situation. "You're lucky to have come on a quiet night," Greta commented, with a tone that oscillated between sarcasm and serenity. Hans snorted, clutching the burglary tool as if it were a guarantee of power. "Stop talking and show me where the safe is." Klaus remained silent, but his eyes scanned every corner of the room. The house seemed larger than he had imagined, and his discomfort grew with every step. He noticed that Greta was squinting at him, as if realizing his hesitation. They reached the library, a large room with walls lined with bookshelves that reached up to the ceiling. In the center was a heavy oak table and an upholstered armchair. Greta stopped in front of one of the shelves, running her hand over one of the books, and looked at Hans with an enigmatic smile. "What you're looking for is here, but it takes patience." Hans tapped his foot impatiently. "No more games, old woman. Open up." Greta pulled out a book with a red leather cover. There was a click, followed by the discreet creak of a hidden door opening in the wall. Hans widened his eyes, his expression changing from irritation to elation. "I knew it. I knew there was something hidden in here." He pushed Greta aside and entered the secret room, turning on the flashlight. Klaus followed reluctantly, while Greta watched closely, showing no resistance. The secret room was small, but shone with the glow of accumulated riches. Shelves lined up with glittering jewels, boxes full of gold coins, and in the corner, a few gold bars were stacked. Hans let out a laugh, turning on himself like a child in a candy store. "Look at that, Klaus. It's much more than I imagined." Klaus, on the other hand, looked uneasy. He noticed the look on Greta's face, who was now standing in the doorway with her arms crossed and an almost defiant smile. "Hans, this doesn't seem right. It's too much. Why doesn't she have any security system?" Hans paused for a moment, still holding a pearl necklace in his hands, and looked at Klaus with irritation. "Because she's an eccentric old woman, Klaus. Stop making up problems where none exist." Klaus tried to argue, but Greta interrupted, her voice calm and firm. "Maybe you should ask yourselves what someone like me does to protect something like that." Hans laughed again, taking no notice. "Please, Greta, do you think your invisible guardian story is going to scare us? We're taking all this here and you're going to stay very quiet." Klaus looked at her, expecting some reaction, but Greta did nothing, except take a small silver bell from the pocket of her dress. "Be careful what you wish for, young man," she said, ringing the bell softly. The sound was clear and crisp, echoing through the library. Hans rolled his eyes, but Klaus stepped back instinctively, feeling his stomach turn. "What was that, old woman? Some kind of trick to scare us?" Hans asked, but in the next instant there was a sound that made his blood run cold. Footsteps, heavy, slow, echoing across the floorboards of the living room. A deep, menacing growl followed, reverberating through the walls of the house. Klaus looked at Hans, his eyes wide with terror. "Hans, there's something in here." Hans raised the flashlight, pointing it at the door to the secret room, but Greta blocked the way, motionless. "It's not something," she said with a cold smile. "It's someone. The guardian of the place." The sound of footsteps was closer now, followed by heavy, almost animalistic breathing. The light from Hans's flashlight flickered in his hand as he pointed it towards the entrance to the library. A gigantic shadow appeared in the doorway, and then Lupo's amber eyes glowed in the darkness. Lupo entered the library with firm steps, each heavy paw resounding on the wooden floor. The flickering light of Hans's lantern revealed the immensity of the animal. Its body was covered in shiny black fur, and its amber eyes seemed to pierce the souls of the two invaders. It growled low, the deep sound causing Klaus to take another step back. Hans tried to keep control of the situation. He raised the burglary tool, pointing it at the wolf as if it were a gun. "Get that monster away, Greta, or I'll deal with him." His voice trembled, despite his attempt to sound firm. Greta, standing at the entrance to the secret room, watched the scene with the calm of someone who knew exactly what was about to happen. "Hans, do you think you can face something you don't even understand?" She spoke in a warning tone, the little bell still dangling from her hand. Lupo doesn't like trespassers, and he knows exactly who threatens this place. Klaus was paralyzed. He tried to rationalize what he was seeing, but Lupo's size and posture defied all logic. It wasn't just a dog, that was obvious. Every fiber of his being told him that they were facing something dangerous and wild. "Hans, maybe we should leave," Klaus suggested, his voice laced with dread. Hans snorted, forcing a nervous laugh. "You're giving up because of a big dog? Be quiet." He raised the lantern, trying to intimidate Lupo, but the wolf stepped forward, growling even louder. The sound reverberated through the library, and for a moment, it seemed as if even the walls were vibrating. "Lupo, sit down," Greta ordered, her voice cutting through the room like a blade. To Klaus's surprise, Lupo obeyed. He sat down, but the growling persisted, his eyes never leaving Hans. Greta approached with firm steps, her shoes echoing on the floor. "You broke into my house, threatened my life, and dared to touch what doesn't belong to you. Now you'll have to deal with the consequences." Hans, in a last act of desperation, advanced towards Greta, pointing the tool in her direction. "Stop this theater! Put that animal away or I'll finish you off now!" But before he could take another step, Lupo leapt. It was lightning fast. In an instant, he was on top of Hans, knocking him to the ground with overwhelming force. The tool slipped out of Hans's hand and fell with a dry sound. Klaus screamed, but couldn't move. He watched, petrified, as Lupo held Hans immobilized, his exposed teeth just inches from his face. "Calm down, Lupo," Greta said, her voice calm. "Not yet." Lupo stepped back slightly, but remained on top of Hans, her claws pressing into his chest. Hans was pale, his face covered in sweat as he gasped. "Please, please get that monster off me!" Greta turned to Klaus, who was now leaning against the wall, shaking like a leaf in the wind. "What about you, young man? Do you have anything to say?" Klaus raised his hands in surrender. I didn't mean to do it. It was his idea." He pointed at Hans. "I only came because I had no choice." Greta narrowed her eyes, assessing Klaus for a moment. "We always have choices. You just made the wrong one." She picked up the bell again and shook it once. Lupo looked at her, awaiting instructions. Klaus fell to his knees, begging, "Please, ma'am, I swear I won't come back. Just let us go." Hans, still trapped under Lupo, screamed, "Don't listen to him. He's a coward. Let's get out of here, but it's not over yet." Greta sighed, shaking her head. "You don't understand, do you? It's not about choice now. It's about learning a lesson." She walked over to a nearby drawer and pulled out a rope. With a glance at Klaus, she handed it to him. "Tie your friend up, very tightly. Now." Klaus hesitated, but Lupo's approach, with a low growl, convinced him. He took the rope and began to tie Hans, who struggled and cursed, but couldn't resist. When the work was done, Greta picked up the fallen tool and looked at them both. "Now, wait here. I'm going to call the police." Hans shouted in frustration as Lupo continued to watch them closely. Klaus silently felt tears streaming down his face. He knew that night would mark his life forever. Hans was on the floor, tied up, and in a cold sweat. The rope around his wrists and ankles left him no chance of escape. Lupo lay motionless next to him, his amber eyes fixed and his deep breathing seeming to dominate the room. Klaus, cowering in the corner of the library, watched with wide eyes as Greta maintained absolute control of the situation. "You're making a mistake," Hans shouted, his voice a mixture of anger and despair. "Do you know who I am? I'm not going to let this go." Greta leaned over slightly, resting her hands on the cane she was holding. Her expression was disconcertingly calm. "And do you know who I am, boy? I'm a woman who has faced more than you could ever imagine. And today, I have a guardian who takes care of what's left." Hans tried to struggle, but Lupo's penetrating gaze made him freeze. Every time the wolf moved, even the slightest, the panic grew on his face. Klaus, on the other side of the room, stammered, Please! I didn't want to be here. I didn't want to hurt anyone. I just—" Greta held up a hand to silence him. "Your motives don't matter now, young man. What matters is what you've learned tonight." She then walked over to an armchair, sitting down with the poise of a queen before a court. Greta began to speak while stroking the silver bell between her fingers. "When my husband died, he left behind more than money. He left behind the lesson that greed, without limits, is the ruin of any man. He knew this because he was consumed by it, and I, tired of that same rot, came here. I chose peace. But I always knew that one day, the greed of others would knock on my door." Hans interrupted her, his face now red with frustration. "Do you think you can teach us a moral lesson? You live in isolation, but you're surrounded by riches. How do you expect people not to come after that?" Greta didn't answer immediately. She looked at Lupo, who took a step forward, letting out a low growl, enough to make Hans swallow dry. Klaus, trembling, tried to calm the situation. "Please, ma'am, he didn't mean it. He's just hot-headed. We'll get out of here and never come back, I promise." Greta turned her gaze to Klaus, her countenance now more compassionate. "You seem to have fear, but also regret. Why did you follow this path, young man?" Klaus bowed his head in shame. "I was out of options. No money, no job. He promised me it would be easy. I thought that it was the only way out." Greta sighed, shaking her head. "There are always choices, Klaus, but wrong choices bring consequences." At that moment, Hans, taking advantage of Greta's focus on Klaus, tried to crawl across the floor towards the exit. But before he could advance a meter, Lupo launched himself at him with an impressive leap. The wolf's heavy paw pressed Hans's shoulder against the floor, and the thief let out a cry of pain. Right! I give up! Just get that thing off me!" he pleaded, without any trace of his initial arrogance. Greta stood up from the armchair, calmly adjusting her dress. "Lupo, keep it there. I don't trust empty words." The wolf kept Hans immobilized while Greta made her way to a small table in the library. She opened a drawer and took out an antique gun, a revolver that looked more like a relic than a functional weapon. Klaus's eyes widened at the sight. "Please, don't hurt us. We've learned, I swear." Greta pointed the gun at Hans, who started babbling disconnected words of panic. "You know what's funny?" she said with a slight smile. "This gun isn't even loaded. I don't need it. I've never needed it. It's just a reminder that fear alone is a powerful weapon." She placed the revolver on the table and looked at Lupo. "You've done enough, my dear. Step aside." Lupo backed away slowly, but didn't take his eyes off Hans. Greta picked up the landline phone on the table and dialed the police. As she made the call, Greta looked once more at Klaus, whose face was now soaked with tears. She knew he was different from Hans. The remorse was clear on his face. "Klaus, if there's one thing you can learn tonight, it's that you should never put yourself in a position like this again. You have the power to choose another path." He nodded repeatedly, as if her every word were a divine command. Hanging up the phone, Greta gestured with her hand. Now, be quiet. The police are on their way. You won't be hurt. At least not by me. Hans, now resigned, lay on the floor, staring at the ceiling. Klaus bowed his head, mumbling a weak thank you. Greta, for her part, sat up again, watching Lupo as he prowled around the two intruders like a living shadow. The headlights of the police car illuminated the garden of the estate shortly afterwards. Two officers entered the house, armed, but stopped when they saw Greta waiting calmly in the doorway, with Lupo by her side. They're in the library, tied up. They didn't cause any major damage, but I think they've learned a lesson, Greta said with a calmness that disconcerted the policeman. Hans was led away shouting and protesting, while Klaus walked with his head down, mumbling apologies. Greta watched the scene in silence with Lupo sitting beside her like a victorious guardian. Before getting into the car, Klaus looked at Greta. Thank you for not hurting me. I'll change, I promise. She just nodded. When the house was silent again, Greta returned to the library. She put away the bell and the revolver, while Lupo lay down by the fire, finally at peace. Another job well done, my darling, she said, stroking his head. Outside, the forest continued to whisper, but no one else would dare challenge the old lady and her faithful guardian.